It's 9 a.m. on a crisp Monday morning in Millbrook Valley. The courthouse is buzzing with anticipation. Lawyers in $1,000 suits check their Rolexes, court reporters adjust their machines, and spectators whisper among themselves. Everyone's waiting for the same thing: their first glimpse of the new judge who's about to preside over one of the most important cases this small county has seen in decades. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom creak open, all heads turn, and then silence. Walking down the center aisle is a man who looks like he'd be more at home behind a plow than behind a bench. His boots, genuine work boots, not the polished kind lawyers wear, still carry traces of yesterday's mud. His hands, weathered and calloused, grip a worn leather briefcase that's seen better days. His suit, while clean and pressed, is clearly off the rack from a department store, not tailored on Savile Row. The whispers start immediately. Is that really him? Are you kidding me? This is our new judge? Eyes roll, smirks are exchanged. In the gallery, a woman in pearls actually shakes her head in disbelief. The high-powered attorneys at the plaintiff's table exchange knowing glances, their confidence suddenly boosted. This was going to be easier than they thought. But sometimes, just sometimes, the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary-looking people. And Ezekiel Zeke Thornfield was about to teach everyone in that courtroom a lesson they'd never forget. Zeke Thornfield hadn't always dreamed of being a judge. 3 years ago, he was living a completely different life, one that revolved around sunrise chores, crop rotations, and the kind of honest work that builds character, but rarely builds wealth. The Thornfield farm had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from grandfather to father to son, like a sacred trust. Zeke Thornfield hadn't always dreamed of being a judge. 3 years ago, he was living a completely different life, one that revolved around sunrise chores, crop rotations, and the kind of honest work that builds character but rarely builds wealth. The Thornfield farm had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from grandfather to father to son, like a sacred trust. Zeke had loved every acre of that land. He knew which fields held water best after spring rains, which sections needed more fertilizer, and exactly when to plant to avoid the late frosts that could destroy a season's work. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Cassandra, right there on the farm, under the old oak tree that had watched over Thornfield land for over a century. But love for the land and knowledge of farming weren't enough to protect him from what came next. MegaCorp Industries had set their sights on expanding into rural counties, and the Thornfield farm sat right in the path of their development plans. What followed was a legal battle that would change Zeke's life forever, though not in the way anyone expected. The corporate lawyers came with their briefcases full of precedents, their arguments polished to a shine, and their confidence that a simple farmer wouldn't know how to fight back. They buried Zeke in paperwork, challenged every aspect of his property rights, and slowly, methodically, built a case that would force him to sell. Zeke fought back the only way he knew how, with determination and an unwavering belief in what was right. He spent his evenings at the kitchen table, reading law books he'd borrowed from the county library, trying to understand the complex language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Cassandra would bring him coffee and sit beside him, helping him make sense of legal concepts that felt as foreign as a different language. "You're going to beat them, Zeke," she'd say, her hand warm on his shoulder. Right has to count for something. But right, as Zeke learned, doesn't always win in court. Despite his best efforts, despite the justice he felt in his bones, the legal system failed him. MegaCorp's lawyers found loopholes, exploited technicalities, and eventually forced the sale of the farm that had been his family's legacy. The day they lost the farm was the day Zeke's world changed forever. Standing in the empty farmhouse, surrounded by boxes containing 3 generations of memories, he made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'm going to law school," he told Cassandra. She looked at him with those steady brown eyes that had seen him through every crisis of their marriage. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. If I'm going to lose to the law, I'm going to learn the law. And maybe, just maybe, I can help other people avoid what happened to us." What followed were the hardest 3 years of Zeke's life. He enrolled in night classes at the regional university, driving 2 hours each way after working construction jobs during the day. Money was tight, tighter than it had ever been on the farm. They moved to a small apartment in town, trading the endless sky and rolling fields for the view of a parking lot and the sound of traffic. But Zeke persevered. While his classmates, mostly young, ambitious students in their 20s, studied in coffee shops and dorm rooms, Zeke studied at the kitchen table of their tiny apartment, the same way he'd studied when fighting for his farm. Cassandra worked double shifts at the diner to help pay for his books and tuition. "You're the oldest student in every class," she'd tease him gently. "Doesn't that bother you?" "Age is just a number," Zeke would reply, not looking up from his constitutional law textbook. "Wisdom, that's what matters." And he was gaining wisdom, not just book knowledge, but the deep understanding that comes from living through injustice and choosing to fight it rather than surrender to it. His professors noticed something different about him. While other students approached law as an intellectual exercise, Zeke approached it as a calling. He graduated summa cum laude, passed the bar exam on his first try, and immediately began working as a public defender. For 2 years he fought for people who couldn't afford high-powered lawyers, people who reminded him of himself. Hardworking, honest, and facing a system that seemed rigged against them. When Judge Morrison announced his retirement, Zeke knew it was time. He applied for the position, underwent the rigorous interview process, and was selected by the Judicial Committee. The appointment made headlines in the local paper. Local farmer turned lawyer to serve as county judge. The reactions were mixed. Some people were proud that one of their own had achieved such a position. Others questioned whether a man who'd lost his own farm could be trusted to make legal decisions for others. Zeke didn't let the doubts bother him. He'd learned long ago that people's opinions matter less than their actions, and actions matter less than their consequences. He was ready to serve, ready to ensure that justice wasn't just a word carved in stone above the courthouse door, but a living principle that protected everyone who walked through those doors. The courthouse in Millbrook Valley had seen its share of important cases over the years, but nothing quite like Fenwick's family hardware store versus MegaCorp Industries. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew Zeke's story. His first major case as a judge would pit a small, family-owned business against the same corporate giant that had destroyed his farm. Mariana Chen, the court clerk who'd worked in the courthouse for 15 years, watched nervously as the courtroom filled with spectators. She'd known Zeke since he was fighting his own legal battles, and she'd watched his transformation from desperate farmer to determined law student to respected public defender. But this was different. This was his first day as a judge, and the pressure was enormous. "You ready for this, Your Honor?" she asked quietly as Zeke reviewed his notes in chambers. He looked up at her with those calm blue eyes that had seen too much hardship to be rattled by pressure. "As ready as I can be, Mariana. Justice doesn't care whether you're ready, it just cares whether you're willing." The case itself was complex. Fenwick's family hardware store had been a fixture in Millbrook Valley for 40 years. Founded by Thaddeus Fenwick, it was the kind of place where 3 generations of families had bought their tools, their garden supplies, and their Christmas lights. When old Thaddeus passed away, his daughter Cordelia took over, maintaining the same commitment to personal service and community involvement that had made the store beloved. But MegaCorp Industries had plans for expansion, and they wanted Fenwick's location for a new big-box store. When Cordelia refused to sell, MegaCorp began what could only be described as a campaign of legal warfare. They challenged the store's licenses, filed complaints about zoning violations, and eventually sued for breach of an old contract that Thaddeus had signed decades earlier. The contract was a labyrinth of legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. MegaCorp's lawyers argued that a technicality in the original agreement gave them the right to force the sale. Cordelia's lawyer, a local attorney named Rigby Blackwood, countered that the contract was invalid due to changes in zoning laws and unfair business practices. Leading MegaCorp's legal team was Valencia Ashworth, a senior partner from a prestigious firm in the state capital. She was everything Zeke wasn't: polished, connected, and confident in her ability to manipulate the legal system to her advantage. She'd won cases like this before, usually by overwhelming small-town lawyers with superior resources and intimidating judges with her reputation. As the trial began, Valencia's strategy became clear. She would bury the courtroom in legal precedents, confuse the issues with complex arguments, and count on the inexperienced judge to make mistakes that would favor her client. "Your Honor," Valencia began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of courtroom victories, "we're dealing with a simple matter of contract law. The defendant signed an agreement and now they want to break it because it's inconvenient. The law doesn't allow for such convenience." She spoke as if she were addressing a child, her tone condescending and her manner dismissive. Behind her, the MegaCorp executives sat in their expensive suits, confident that their money and legal firepower would carry the day. Rigby Blackwood, representing Cordelia, did his best to counter Valencia's arguments, but it was clear he was outmatched. He was a good lawyer, but he was used to handling divorces and property disputes, not complex corporate litigation. He stumbled over legal terminology, mispronounced Latin phrases, and generally looked like what he was: a small-town attorney facing big-city legal artillery. As the morning progressed, the spectators began to murmur. It looked like another case of David versus Goliath, except this time David had forgotten his sling. Valencia grew bolder as the trial continued. She began addressing Zeke with barely concealed contempt, speaking slowly and using simple words as if she were talking to someone who might not understand complex legal concepts. "Perhaps Your Honor would like me to explain the precedent in Wickham vs. Continental Industries," she asked, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "It's a bit complicated, but I'm sure we can make it clear." The lawyers in the gallery smirked. The court reporter tried to hide her embarrassment for the new judge. Even Cordelia Fenwick began to look worried, wondering if her fate was being decided by a man who might be in over his head. But Zeke just sat quietly, taking notes in his careful handwriting, occasionally asking brief questions that seemed almost naive in their simplicity. He didn't interrupt Valencia's lengthy arguments or object to her condescending tone. He simply listened, absorbed, and waited. As the trial moved into its second day, the pattern continued. Valencia presented increasingly complex arguments, citing obscure precedents and overwhelming the courtroom with legal jargon. Rigby struggled to respond, clearly outgunned and outmaneuvered. And then something changed. It was during Valencia's argument about federal commerce regulations that the moment arrived. She was deep into a complex citation about interstate business practices when she made a crucial error. She misquoted a Supreme Court decision, confident that no one in the courtroom would catch her mistake. As the court clearly stated in Morrison versus Olson, Valencia proclaimed, federal law supersedes all local ordinances when it comes to commercial enterprise. The courtroom was silent. Rigby looked confused. The spectators seemed impressed by the legal sophistication of the argument. And then Judge Zeke Thornfield spoke. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom, "I believe you're misremembering the Morrison decision." Valencia paused, surprised. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. Morrison versus Olson. You've cited it incorrectly. The court's decision in that case actually supports the opposite conclusion, that local ordinances can indeed supersede federal commerce regulations when they serve a compelling community interest." The courtroom fell silent. Valencia's confident expression faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Your Honor, I respectfully disagree. The Morrison decision clearly states—" "The Morrison decision," Zeke interrupted gently, "states, and I quote, while federal commerce regulations provide a framework for interstate business, they cannot be used to override local ordinances that serve legitimate community interests and do not impose an undue burden on interstate commerce." Justice Brennan wrote the majority opinion. Justice Scalia dissented on procedural grounds but agreed with the fundamental principle. He looked directly at Valencia, his blue eyes steady and calm. "Would you like me to continue with the full citation, Ms. Ashworth?" Or would you prefer to revise your argument? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Valencia, one of the most successful corporate lawyers in the state, stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. She had been caught in a fundamental error by a judge she had assumed was an easy mark, but Zeke wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing stronger, your argument about the Fenwick contract fails to account for the doctrine of unconscionability as established in Williams versus Walker Thomas Furniture. When a contract is so one-sided that it shocks the conscience, courts have the authority to void it, regardless of the technical legality of its language. He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, everyone in the courtroom could see the intelligence that had been hidden behind his humble appearance. I've read the Fenwick contract, Ms. Ashworth, all 47 pages of it. I've also read the correspondence between MegaCorp and Mr. Thaddeus Fenwick from 1987 to 1995. Your client used its superior bargaining position to insert clauses that no reasonable person would have agreed to if they had understood their implications. Valencia tried to respond, but Zeke held up a hand. I'm not finished. You've also failed to address the equitable estoppel doctrine. For 20 years, MegaCorp accepted payments from Fenwick's hardware without invoking the clauses you now claim give you the right to force a sale. Under established legal precedent, this constitutes a waiver of those rights. The transformation was complete. The man who had walked into the courtroom looking like a farmer was now clearly revealed as a legal scholar of the highest caliber. His knowledge wasn't just comprehensive, it was surgical in its precision. Valencia made one last attempt to regain control. Your Honor, with respect, these are complex matters of corporate law that require what, Ms. Ashworth? Zeke's voice was quiet but carried the authority of absolute certainty. That require expensive suits and prestigious law degrees? That require speaking down to people who work with their hands? He stood up, and suddenly the courtroom felt different. The air itself seemed to crackle with intensity. Let me tell you something about complex matters of corporate law, Miss Ashworth. 3 years ago, I was sitting where Mrs. Fenwick is sitting now. I was fighting for something that mattered. My family's farm, my heritage, my future. And lawyers just like you used the same tactics you're using today. They buried me in paperwork, confused me with jargon, and counted on my ignorance to win their case. His voice carried the weight of personal experience, and everyone in the courtroom could hear it. They won, Ms. Ashworth. They took my farm, and they destroyed my family's legacy. But they also did something else. They taught me that justice isn't about who has the most expensive lawyer or who can cite the most obscure precedent. Justice is about fairness, about protecting the vulnerable, and about ensuring that the law serves the people. Not the other way around. The courtroom was riveted. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to listen. So when you stand in my courtroom and try to use your legal expertise to intimidate and confuse, you're not just insulting me, you're insulting everyone who has ever been steamrolled by the system. You're insulting every farmer who's lost his land, every small business owner who's been crushed by corporate power, and every person who's ever believed that right matters more than might. He sat back down, but his presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Now, Ms. Ashworth, would you like to present an argument based on the actual law, or would you prefer to continue with your theatrical performance? The rest of the trial was a masterclass in legal reasoning. Zeke systematically dismantled MegaCorp's arguments, not through intimidation or showmanship, but through careful analysis and profound understanding of the law. He cited precedents from memory, explained complex legal principles in language everyone could understand, and demonstrated a grasp of jurisprudence that left the experienced lawyers in the courtroom speechless. Valencia, her confidence shattered, struggled to respond to Zeke's legal analysis. Her arguments became increasingly desperate as she realized she was facing a judge who not only understood the law better than she did, but who had lived through the kind of injustice her client was trying to perpetrate. Rigby Blackwood, meanwhile, seemed to grow in stature as the trial progressed. With a fair judge who understood the real issues at stake, he was able to present his case clearly and effectively. The playing field had been leveled, and suddenly the law was working the way it was supposed to work. When it came time for closing arguments, Zeke listened carefully to both sides. Valencia made a final plea based on the technicalities of contract law, while Rigby focused on the human impact of MegaCorp's actions. After a brief recess, Zeke returned to deliver his verdict. "This case," he began, "represents everything that's wrong with our legal system, and everything that's right with it. It's wrong when powerful corporations use their resources to overwhelm smaller opponents. It's wrong when lawyers use complexity to obscure simple truths. And it's wrong when the law becomes a weapon instead of a shield." He looked directly at Valencia and the MegaCorp executives. "But it's right when judges remember that their job is to serve justice, not convenience. It's right when the law protects the vulnerable from the powerful. And it's right when we remember that behind every legal argument is a human being whose life will be affected by our decision." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The contract between MegaCorp and Fenwick's hardware store is unconscionable. It was designed to trap Mr. Fenwick in an agreement that he couldn't fully understand, with consequences that weren't clearly explained. Furthermore, MegaCorp's 20-year acceptance of payments without invoking the disputed clauses." Valencia slumped in her chair. The MegaCorp executives looked stunned. "Therefore, I find in favor of Fenwick's hardware store. The contract is void and MegaCorp's claim to the property is without merit." The courtroom erupted in applause. Cordelia Fenwick began to cry with relief. Even some of the lawyers who had initially dismissed Zeke were now nodding in approval. But Zeke wasn't finished. "However," he continued, raising his voice above the noise, "I want to address something more important than this particular case. This courtroom represents the hopes and dreams of everyone in this community. When people come here, they're not just seeking legal resolution. They're seeking justice. They're trusting that the system will treat them fairly, regardless of how much money they have or how powerful their opponents are." He looked out at the packed courtroom, his eyes moving from face to face. "I made a promise when I took this job. I promise that every person who enters this courtroom will be treated with dignity and respect. I promise that the law will be applied fairly, without regard to wealth or status. And I promise that justice will not be reserved for those who can afford it." His voice grew stronger with each word. "I've seen what happens when the legal system fails people. I've lived through it. And I will not let it happen in my courtroom. The law belongs to all of us, and it will serve all of us." The applause this time was thunderous. Even Valencia, despite her defeat, found herself moved by the sincerity and power of Zeke's words. In the weeks that followed, word of Judge Thornfield's remarkable debut spread throughout the legal community. Lawyers who had initially dismissed him as an amateur began to speak of him with respect and admiration. Law students traveled from across the state to observe his courtroom, eager to learn from his approach to justice. Valencia Ashworth, in a surprising turn of events, requested a private meeting with Zeke after the trial. She found him in his chambers, still wearing his simple off-the-rack suit, still carrying his weathered briefcase. "Judge Thornfield," she said, her voice lacking its earlier arrogance, "I owe you an apology." Zeke looked up from his paperwork, his expression neutral. "For what, Miss Ashworth?" "For underestimating you, for treating you with disrespect, for assuming that because you came from a farm, you couldn't understand the law." She sat down across from him, her usual confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I've been practicing law for 23 years, and I've never been schooled like that. You didn't just know the law, you understood it. You understood what it's supposed to accomplish." Zeke nodded slowly. "The law isn't a game, Ms. Ashworth. It's not about winning or losing. It's about finding truth and delivering justice." "I know that now," Valencia replied. "Or maybe I always knew it, but I forgot somewhere along the way." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Your Honor, I think this community is lucky to have you." After she left, Zeke sat alone in his chambers, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. 3 years ago, he had been a broken man, defeated by the very system he now served. But that defeat had taught him something invaluable. It had shown him what justice really meant. Mariana knocked softly on his door. "Judge Thornfield? There's someone here to see you." Cordelia Fenwick entered, her face glowing with gratitude. "Judge Thornfield, I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary, Mrs. Fenwick. I just did my job." "No," she said firmly. "You did more than your job. You gave me hope. You showed me that the system can work when good people are in charge of it." She placed a small wrapped package on his desk. "This was my father's. He always said that the measure of a man isn't how much he owns, but how much he helps others. I think he would have wanted you to have it." Inside the package was a small wooden gavel, hand-carved and worn smooth by years of use. Thaddeus Fenwick had served as a volunteer mediator in the community for decades, helping neighbors resolve disputes without resorting to expensive litigation. Harris was bent over backward in his chair, as though someone else was doing the leg. "Hera believed in justice, the same way you do, Cordelia." As the months passed, Judge Zeke Thornfield's reputation continued to grow. His courtroom became known as a place where justice was more than just a word, it was a living principle that guided every decision. Lawyers learned to come prepared with solid arguments rather than legal tricks. People began to trust the system again, knowing that their cases would be decided on merit rather than on the size of their legal budget. The man who had once lost everything to the law had become its most effective servant. His transformation from farmer to judge was complete, but the values that had shaped him on the farm, honesty, hard work, and a deep sense of fairness, remained the foundation of his judicial philosophy. One evening, as Zeke was leaving the courthouse, he encountered a group of young lawyers who had been observing his court. One of them, a recent law school graduate named Marcus, approached him nervously. "Judge Thornfield, could I ask you a question?" "Of course." How did you know all those case citations, all those precedents? You made it look easy." Zeke smiled, remembering his own days of struggling with legal texts at his kitchen table. "It wasn't easy, Marcus, but I had something that made me study harder than anyone else." "What was that?" "I had lived through injustice. I knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of the law, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I couldn't afford to fight properly. That knowledge drove me to learn everything I could about the law, so I could make sure it never happened to anyone else in my courtroom." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying that your experience as a farmer actually helped you become a better judge?" "I'm saying that every experience we have, every challenge we face, every failure we endure, it all becomes part of who we are. The question isn't whether you'll face hardship, Marcus. The question is what you'll do with it." He looked back at the courthouse, its windows glowing in the evening light. "I lost my farm, but I found my calling. Sometimes what looks like the end is actually the beginning." The young lawyer walked away inspired, carrying with him the lesson that Judge Thornfield embodied every day, that true wisdom comes not from privilege or position, but from the courage to transform pain into purpose. Years later, when law students study the transformation of rural justice systems, they often point to the case of Fenwick's hardware store versus MegaCorp Industries as a turning point. But the real story isn't about legal precedents or courtroom drama. It's about a man who refused to let defeat define him, who chose to fight injustice by mastering the very system that had defeated him. Judge Ezekiel Thornfield never forgot where he came from. His chambers were decorated not with diplomas or awards, but with pictures of the farm he had lost and the community he now served. On his desk sat Thaddeus Fenwick's hand-carved gavel, a reminder that justice isn't about the tools you use, but about the heart that guides them. The moral of this story isn't that appearances can be deceiving, though they certainly can be. It's not that education can transform anyone, though it certainly can. The real lesson is simpler and more profound, that every person carries within them the seeds of greatness, and that our greatest defeats often become the foundation of our greatest victories. When people rolled their eyes at the farmer who walked into their courtroom, they were seeing only the surface. They couldn't see the nights spent studying by lamplight, the determination forged in the fire of loss, or the deep well of compassion that comes from personal suffering. They couldn't see that this man had been broken by the law, and had chosen to become its most devoted servant. In the end, Judge Thornfield's greatest judgment wasn't any case he decided, but the decision he made in his own life, to transform injustice into justice, defeat into victory, and pain into purpose. He proved that wisdom isn't about where you've been, but about where you're willing to go. And in doing so, he reminded everyone who entered his courtroom that the scales of justice are balanced not by the weight of wealth or the power of position, but by the simple truth that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and fairness under the law. The farmer had become a judge, but more importantly, he had become a symbol of hope for everyone who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or written off. His story reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places, waiting for their moment to show the world what they're truly capable of.